one, I did, for those students who came and asked about it, I did reopen quiz too. But it had to be done by today. So hopefully you did that. Okay, so I extended that a couple of days for those that got caught up with the typo that I had about November 2nd. Okay, so, but again, I had said that in class. If you'd been here and heard that, then it wouldn't have been an issue, but I opened it up for a couple more days. It should be done now. So deadline for the quiz 2 is over. As soon as we get out of class, I'll release the quiz to you, so you can take a look at it and use it to study. And then if you have any questions, let me know about that. The other thing I wanted to more importantly point out, of course, we have exam number 2 coming up next class period, Tuesday. And I'm going to send the sign-in sheet around here in just a moment, so you'll tell me which test you want to take, the Scantron or the essay test. Okay? I'll talk about the test in just a moment, but you hopefully should be have made up your mind as to which test you want to take. But I wanted to draw your attention to something that I was able to finalize just this morning, actually. On the handout, or excuse me, on the home page, if you log into WebCT to our class, there's a new feature down here, lecture podcasts. Okay? If you've missed any lectures, if you haven't been able to be here, these are the lectures, at least back to October 7th. That's when they were finally able to let me know that this was possible. Right? So what's happening is they're recording the lectures synced up to my PowerPoints in the room. Right? The room itself is recording them. Okay? And then they sent me the links to these, which I posted here. Okay? Now, the problem in terms of trying to show you this right now is a few days ago somebody came in here and stole a bunch of equipment, and we have no sound system in here. They took everything out of here. So I can't play it for you. I can show it to you just so you get a sense of it. Let me just say a couple of things. If you have poor internet connections, or if you don't have the right software, you're going to need QuickTime, I think is what this runs through, then it's up to you to make this work. Okay? You may need to come up here and listen to it in one of the computer labs, right? So I don't want to hear any complaints about it didn't work, okay? You make it work. I'm just posting it here as one more resource for you if you missed out on a lecture, right? So clicking on here, it'll load up. And what you'll see is there's a number of different, you can organize it a number of different ways. You can have just the PowerPoint. I believe that if you do the high-speed version of it, it's actually me up here talking as well as the PowerPoint, so you can kind of manipulate however you want. Or you can just listen to it, right? So it starts recording at 9:30, right? So you're going to, again, the setup time, kind of fast forward through that a little bit. And obviously you don't, after 9:20, or excuse me, 10:20, 10:50, excuse me, at the end of class, it still records for another 10 minutes or so. So you don't have to listen to the whole thing. So it records for an hour and a half from 9:30 to 11 is what it's doing here. So you can see it again. We have no sound in the room, so I can't give you this, but it's capturing the screenshots is what it's doing. So if you move the bar along, right, here's. Can you hear that?
I must have been accidental.
What did you say? What was that? Or am I hearing this somewhere else? Or is that your pen? What am I hearing? Anyways, I'm hearing something. But again, you can see if we had speakers that were working.
Could it be those somewhere?
I don't know. It may be, but it's not working the way it's supposed to because somebody stole our speakers. I'm just letting you know. Again, if you were here, this is all familiar. You've seen the PowerPoints. But if you missed a lecture, here's the lecture with the notes to help you out. That's all I'm just drawing your attention to. Okay. So it's under lecture podcast by date. Okay. So whatever date you might have missed, here it is. Yes.
The room didn't record the person stealing the stuff.
No, you have to request that it record from this time to this time, so not everybody has that. And I doubt they were in here while there was a class in here. I hope that didn't happen that often. Although you never know, okay? So just one more resource. If you missed a lecture or you just want review, right? I've gotten a few requests how to improve my studying, how to do better on the upcoming exams. One of the things I do tell people is recording the lectures is a good way to do that. Now that requires a lot of time to listen to this again, but it does allow you to capture some of the information you might have missed because you're so busy writing everything down, which is why I provide you the notes to kind of help with some of the note taking. But sometimes it just helps to hear this stuff again. Now, I don't remember exactly what the date was when we started this material, but it's pretty close to right after the first exam. Okay, but these are the dates I have, and then they're obviously recording now. So as soon as we get through today, I'll post today on the new deal as well. Okay, so that's just a resource for you. Okay, but you got to make it work. I don't want to hear one issue about this not working. Okay, that's up to you. The other thing, of course, under course content, had a few people, for some reason, think that the study guide is not here. It's been there for a while. Right? I do have to load a few PowerPoints still here on the 20s, the Great Depression, and the New Deal. I'll get those this afternoon as well. But we should have, after today, all of the material that you're responsible for the second exam. Okay? All right, so I just want to point some of that stuff out. I don't think I need this anymore. Any questions about any of that at this point? Okay, any questions just in general about the format of the exam in terms of making up your mind, Scantron, or essay? Yes?
Oh, well, I was just going to ask about how many questions we're going to be over the war is the health of the state essay.
Well, war is the health of the state is an extra credit assignment. So it's not multiple choice questions. It is, as I think I just had there, study questions that relate to it. So here's a list of questions that you can look at. Of course, this thing always, it kicks you out and then you got to go back in. So, right. List of questions here. This is to just guide you through the reading, right? Remember, this deals with World War I, is what this particular essay was. And there's about 6 questions or so. I'll choose 3 or 4 of them to kind of give you a broad selection, but you'll pick one to write a fairly lengthy paragraph or so responding to these questions. Most of these questions are opinion-oriented. They're kind of to elicit a reaction. There's not necessarily a right or a wrong answer. Unless you don't answer the question, and obviously that's going to be wrong. But I don't care exactly what the answer is. What I'm interested in is your opinion. Why did you come to that conclusion? And in answering that, you need to cite some evidence, some examples from the essay itself. Can convince me you read it. Okay. So this should be a paragraph or so. It's not a big essay or anything, but and it's purely extra credit. You don't have to do it if you don't want to. Okay, but that's what that is. It's not going to be multiple choice questions or something like that. Okay. Okay, so that's that. Any other questions about the exam in terms of just format?
For the essay on overthrow, is the prompts going to be on the test?
Yeah, that's okay. Everybody has to write on overthrow. Everybody. That's not a choice. Okay. In this particular exam, if you take the essay exam, it's one big essay, right? That is the lecture material and all of the readings combined. And those prompts I've already given you, I think there's 6 of them. I'll choose 3, since there's a little bit more of them this time, to give you a little bit more selection. I'll choose 3. You still only write on 1, right? But then everybody is going to write on Kinzer's overthrow, right? The first 4 chapters you're responsible for. Now, what is the expectation of that? This is a small essay at most, right? A couple of pages. It's not a big, huge essay. But what I'm looking for is that the first 3 chapters deal with specific incidents of the United States overthrowing or toppling various governments. Chapter 1 is about Hawaii. Chapter 2 is about the Philippines. And Chapter 3 is about Nicaragua, right? Chapter 4 is kind of a summary of all 3 of those into a historical context of this early imperialism, sort of late 19th century up until about World War I, right? So it's kind of a synthesis of all 3 into a larger historical context of American imperialism. In terms of the prompts or what you'll be responsible for, I'm going to ask you to choose one of those 3 events, the overthrow in terms of Hawaii, the Philippines, or Nicaragua, and put it into the context that we were talking about at the time, the old diplomacy transitioning to the new diplomacy. But this is in lieu of the short identification section that you had to do last time. You don't have any short identification terms that you're responsible for. I listed them there just to kind of remind you of what we've talked about, and they are the basis for multiple choice questions or to answer the essay questions. But the Kinzer prompt will be to choose one of those three chapters, one of those three events, and to basically narrate the events, what happened. Again, convince me you read it, but putting it into a historical context of the new diplomacy. Okay. And everybody's got to do that. That's not an option. Either test, it's the same thing, and that's 30%, 30 points. So again, it's not a huge essay, but it is a little bit of writing.
You said we get to pick which store we talking about?
Yeah, I'll let you pick. Right, again, to give you a little flexibility. This time. Next time, I'll be more specific and make choices for you. Yes. No short identification like there was last time. Right? I put the terms on there. Very good. I put the terms on there just to kind of give you a roadmap of everything we've talked about. And again, you should know those terms because it is either the basis for writing the essay questions you're responsible for, or what I'll make multiple choice Scantron questions about. Right? So knowing those terms is a really good idea. Okay. Any other questions as far as just the format of the test? Yes.
On the essay, did you say you're going to get 3 out of 7?
I think there's 6, right? No, there's 7. Yeah, 3 out of 7. Yeah, and that's explained right there. If you choose the essay exam, that's what it'll look like. If you choose Scantron, that's what it'll look like. All right. Any other questions?
So there's no multiple questions if you take the Scantron
There's no what?
multiple
Choice questions? No. There may be overlap because, again, obviously we talked about Hawaii, we talked about the Philippines, so there may be overlap. So if you've read the Kinzer book, that will help. But if you were here for those lectures, then you're okay for that. Yeah.
And if you take the essay test, how long does the essay have to be?
You just have to answer the question. If it's the big essay question, it's probably about a 4 to 5 page essay. If you take the essay, the Scantron one, the Kinzer one is still probably about a page and a half or so, maybe 2 pages, roughly speaking. But again, this is all handwriting. I don't know, you may have gigantic handwriting and take up 4 blue books. I don't know. Right? So it's a very subjective thing. It's hard to just answer that question. But again, the comment that you're going to get, right, and if those of you that took the essay last time, the comment was, we need details. Don't just list things, explain them. If you mention something and don't describe what it was or explain what it was or why was it important or how does it fit into a historical context and back it up with some details, then we have to assume you don't know, right? You don't mention things in essays, you explain things in essays, right? And however long that takes is a little subjective based on how much detail you go into and, again, handwriting and all that kind of stuff. All right? Any other questions? Just, again, about format or something like that. We're all good? Everybody knows what kind of test they want to take? All right, so once again, as we've done before, just next to your name, find it on the list, and please write Scantron or essay next to it, and I'll print the correct number of tests. All right. All right, so we want to very quickly cruise through the last bit of material before this exam, the New Deal. Okay. Now, by the way, if you're looking for the handout on this particular one, I don't think I have one, right? There isn't one.
No.
It's sort of like what we did with progressivism. If you have the study guide, the terms at the very end, the last set of terms, those are all New Deal terms. That's kind of what I'm going to be going on right here, but I have a PowerPoint for you. Okay, so if you have that study guide, that's where it's coming from. But they'll all be on here as well on the PowerPoint. But this is the one lecture. I don't think I have any lecture notes ahead of time for you. So, okay, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was elected in 1932 as a Democrat. He will be the 3rd Democratic president in the last 72 years, back to before the Civil War. Right? So this is going to be a very, he's going to usher in an entirely new political era in which the Democratic Party is going to rise to prominence as the national party, the leading national party, and the Republicans are going to decline, right? Now, obviously, they're not going to go away, and obviously, they're going to elect some Republican presidents over the next 50 years, right? Like Eisenhower, for example. But the Democratic Party, based upon Roosevelt's leadership and the crisis of the Great Depression, is going to create this new realignment to where the Democrats are largely going to determine and control much of the Congress and many of the presidents, again, for the next 50 years or so. So this is one of those momentous shifts here in the history of American politics. And I think so much of it goes back to simply the personality of Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt was I would argue he is maybe the second greatest president we've ever had, right, behind Abraham Lincoln. Okay? That's a personal opinion, that's an interpretation, and you are free to disagree with that. Right? But Roosevelt led the United States through the two greatest crises of the 20th century, the Great Depression and the Second World War. Right? Everything he did was not successful. Much of what he did actually failed. Right? But through his vision and through his leadership, we did get through these very difficult times. Right? So a little bit about Roosevelt here. This is right as he's about to be inaugurated. In the spring of 1933, right? March of 1933 is when the inaugurations take place. I think Roosevelt is also, he may be, I may claim as the second greatest president we've ever had, but he may very well be the greatest politician we've ever seen in terms of his skill and his talent and his ability. And one of the things that Roosevelt did in the campaign in the summer of 1932, again, I think the Democrats could have run anybody against Herbert Hoover and won because of, again, the bonus army and the overall failure of the Republicans to try to deal with the Great Depression in any meaningful way, right? So Roosevelt, for example, in the campaign of 1932, his campaign slogan, his campaign song was "Happy Days Are Here Again," right? Now here's the lyrics to this, and if we had some sound, I could click on it and play, but that's not going to work today, unfortunately. But I think it was a real sort of a sense of Roosevelt understood what the American people wanted to hear. They wanted a sense that somebody to give them a sense that we were going to get through the Great Depression. This was not going to be the end of the United States as we knew it. Yes, there's going to be change. Yes, there's going to be reform. Yes, it's going to be very difficult. And yes, it's going to take a lot of sacrifice. Absolutely, right? He didn't mince those kind of words. But every time you saw Roosevelt, he looked like this. He was always smiling. He was always optimistic, right? Now, what's interesting about that is that kind of, leadership, or at least the appearance of leadership, is exactly what the American people wanted to hear, wanted to see, right? It's not unlike Obama back in 2008, talking about how we can get through this, and he was constantly positive, and right, gave some amazing speeches, and kind of really stirred up the imagination that we can kind of get through this difficult time, right? And it carried him right through to the White House. The exact same thing is here, only a much more serious crisis that we were dealing with, right? So Roosevelt understood that the American people needed somebody to tell them and to show them, it's not just style, it's got to be substance as well, that we're going to get through this, right? Roosevelt, he's from New York. He's a distant cousin of Theodore Roosevelt, right? Franklin Roosevelt came from the very wealthiest of society in upstate New York, right? He, in many ways, I think as a young man, was extremely arrogant and egotistical and kind of a holier-than-thou, self-righteous, again, he was pretty much a spoiled brat much of his life, right? And he transforms from this young kid into arguably, again, maybe the greatest president we've ever had, one of the greatest statesmen we've ever had. And there's a very interesting reason how this happened, right? Roosevelt actually suffered from polio in 1921, right? He lost the ability to walk, or at least to use his legs in any meaningful way, for most of his adult life, right? And in many ways, what happened is that kind of a medical condition humbled him, and it humbled him dramatically, right? And this is one of Roosevelt's great strengths that makes him so good as a politician, is that when he was dealing with people, he had this ability to connect with people one-on-one in a very personal and respectful manner. That is one of his great strengths, and we'll see this throughout the Great Depression, or excuse me, throughout the New Deal, is he had this ability and this desire to try to restore a sense of dignity in dealing with people, right? And this was genuine because he himself had suffered, right? So this great trial, this great moment in his life here, is going to humble him to the point where it gives him compassion. It gave him sympathy. It gave him empathy in trying to connect with other people who had suffered as well and who were suffering during the Great Depression, right? He actually went to trying to get some medical care and just alleviate some of the problems that he was having with his legs down to Warm Springs, Georgia, right? And there he kind of took over and bought this little health clinic, basically. There was the mineral waters there were pretty good for sort of giving some comfort to people who suffered from polio. He took this over and expanded it into this amazing sort of resort for kids, particularly medical treatment facility to try to help kids who suffered from polio, right? If he had just done that and nothing else, he would have been one of the greatest humanitarians in American history, right? But this affliction that he had, it in many ways gave him such a sense of compassion that he is genuinely trying to help people and restore a sense of dignity here. So we'll see, for example, if you had the choice between a government handout or a job, even if it wasn't a great job, which would you choose? Most people are going to take the job because, again, there's a sense of pride that comes from working, even if it's menial labor, right? And this is something that he understood, is trying to get people back to work, trying to connect with people. And it gave him just such a sense of compassion that, I think a lot of people that had lived in his, grew up in his lifestyle as a young man, they never really connect to average people that way. This humbled him. This brought him down, right? By the way, he never, or rarely ever, do you see him in his wheelchair. Or sometimes he could walk with big, heavy braces on his legs and kind of hobbled around and usually had to have help with somebody. But you almost never saw that because there was a great sense of trying to, censorship is not quite the right word, but the press kind of respected his sort of concern that to not take all these photographs. So there aren't a lot of them, right? Whenever he would give speeches, for example, he would have this little in front of the podium. There would be a little lift back here that kind of pushed him up forward, right? So whenever he's speaking, he's kind of having to move a little bit like this because, again, he can't move, he can't walk, right? So it's kind of interesting. Think about that today. Would we elect somebody as a leader of the free world that couldn't walk? What is that a symbol or a sign of oftentimes? Weakness, right? I think it's a great testament to Roosevelt and his character, as well as the desperation of the American people, that they were willing to elect somebody that could not walk. Now, again, he is not an invalid, right? He is a dynamic personality, but because he lost the use of his legs, I think it humbled him in a way that a lot of presidents and leaders have never experienced, right? Okay, so let's consider a couple of things here. In terms of, happy days are here again, this idea of a New Deal in general. One of the things that he did, and again, this is, as a politician, throughout the whole campaign, he kept talking about a New Deal, a New Deal. The American people deserve a New Deal. He never told us what the New Deal was. Never really explained any details about it. There was no substance behind it whatsoever, right? It was mostly style, and it was great, and everybody loved it, even though we kind of scratched our head going, well, what is it, right? Well, he'll figure that out once he gets elected, right? Don't worry about that now. But happy days are here again, right? And so again, this was kind of this sense of what Roosevelt's going to do when he comes into office is, you might have heard the phrase lately, when you want to criticize somebody, they switch their mind on a position or something like that. What do we call them today when they do that? Flip-flop, sure, right? This is the ultimate flip-flop. There's nobody flip-flops more than this guy, right? But make sure we understand that. That's a strength. That's not a weakness, all right? Because here's what flip-flop actually means. Now, it depends on the context, right? But, you know, if I have a particular opinion about something on Monday, I can't necessarily guarantee you that I'm going to hold that same opinion on Friday because I don't know what's going to happen on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, right? And what one of his great strengths was the ability to experiment. And that is exactly what the Great Depression called for, that you must try all sorts of things. And a lot of what he tried failed. Absolutely failed. It sometimes made it worse, right? Sometimes it made it better. But he was not this dogmatic politician who was going to stick to this right or wrong. He was going to experiment, right? And in that regard, as he's sort of changing his mind on stuff, what he's really doing is just throwing stuff against the wall. And if it sticks, we're going to keep doing it. If it doesn't, we're going to try something else, right? So I would argue that, you know, flip-flopping, again, that's a negative term to suggest that, well, you know, you just sort of, you know, because of the political winds changing or something like that. He's really just scratching his head trying to figure out how can we fix these problems, right? His first inaugural address, again, I would have played it, but that's not working. This is where one of the great inaugural addresses of all time, right? Where he utters the very famous phrase, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself," right? That is this again. That idea that we can get through this. We all have to come together, but we can get through this, right? That's what people wanted to hear. Now remember, this is a time, right? Early 1930s. This is the rise of Adolf Hitler. This is the collapse of many governments across Europe. And within the United States, there are extremists on both sides, to the far left, to the far right, trying to pull this country apart because they too are looking at the Great Depression and saying, from their perspective, all right, America is done, we're finished, we cannot continue the way we are, and they're going to take some rather extreme political views. Roosevelt, one of his really great accomplishments is that while he may be open to experimentation and trying different things, he fundamentally kept America a capitalist, democratic nation, right? That is these two basic traditional principles and values of the United States. We maintain them. Now, that doesn't mean we're not going to reform it. We're going to have to fix some problems, or at least try to fix some of these problems. But basically, we get through the Great Depression, World War II, with these two most important principles, democracy and capitalism, intact, more or less, right? So, this idea that we can get through this is something he kept coming back over and over and over again, right? This is the age, the 1930s, this is the golden age of radio, right? So this is before television, but almost everybody had a radio in their homes. This was part of that 1920s spreading electricity throughout the country. So what he was very good at was, again, connecting to the average person in their homes through what he called the fireside chat. Right? Now, these were radio addresses, right? Now, Obama gives one of these every week. The president gives a weekly radio address, or at least it's on the internet, right? But the problem is, if you do something like that every week, how often are we actually listening to any of that? Almost never, right? At most, if you're watching the news, they'll play a clip from it, but that's the most we ever get, right? And this is one of Roosevelt's great sort of strengths here in understanding the media, is that he is elected president, just so we're clear on this, 4 times, more than any other president, right? He's elected in 32, be reelected in 36, 40, and 44, right? Now, he died in office in 45, so he did not see that last term through, right? But the point is that in that amount of time, how many fireside chats did he actually give? Well, about 16 or 17 of them, right? Not many. And the point of that is that if he came on the radio and did this all the time, they would be less effective, right? But everybody knew when he was going to speak, and everybody literally gathered around, right, the hearth, right? Not the literal hearth, but this fireside chat that we all kind of gather around to hear what the president had to say. And what he was doing was explaining to the American people in very simple language exactly what he was enacting and why he was enacting it, right, in terms of legislation, okay, in terms of policy, in terms of programs, right? So this was a way to connect directly to the American people through the fireside chat, which in many ways, again, as I said, he had that ability to sort of connect to people that most presidents never have. Right? He had that sort of personal charm and charisma here, and he used it very effectively, the fireside chat. Right? Don't want to overdo it, but just when it was necessary. Okay? The other thing we might say, just as an interesting sort of side note here, Roosevelt, I would argue, may be the most powerful president we ever had in terms of exercising real power, is what I mean by that. Because the Democratic Party absolutely dominated the House of Representatives and the Senate. Right? The election of 1932 was not just a presidential victory for the Democrats. They took both houses, and they're going to maintain control of both houses through most of the 1930s. Right? So when I say he exercised more power than most presidents ever had, when he takes office, it begins what's called the first 100 days in office. Right? And notice how we saw this back in 2009, right, when Obama had reached 900 days, right? We kind of give him this little report card, how are you doing, right? This is something we do for all of our presidents, that first 100 days. Well, Roosevelt was the first person to start that, right? This is where it began with him, right? And when I say he exercised real power, in that first 100 days, he pushed through more legislation than he would for the rest of his years in office, that first 100 days. And when I say exercise real power, now who are the lawmakers? Well, that's Congress. Well, presidents don't make laws. Well, unless you're Franklin Roosevelt, all right? Because Roosevelt, and I think this too is a certain testament to just how desperate the American people were. If Roosevelt wanted it, it happened. It was passed. Congressmen are not even reading the legislation that's coming before them, let alone actually debating it. If Roosevelt wanted it, it was passed. And this is why so much legislation goes through, because again, the times were so desperate that the American people, and particularly Congress, were willing to give power to a president that we've never done before to try to solve this crisis, right? So Roosevelt exercised tremendous power, right? He effectively was determining, shaping laws that filled the first 100 days. Right? Now, one of the policies that we want to think about here, of course, economics is going to be the key issue here, is an economic theory based upon John Maynard Keynes. Now, he's a contemporary of Roosevelt. He's a British economist. And the policies that he advocated became known as Keynesian economics. All right? And basically what Keynesian economics is, Keynes said that the crisis, the economic crisis, was so bad and so, we were in such a problem here that the only entity large enough and powerful enough to try to have any chance of fixing it would be the federal government of the United States. Okay? Now, what he meant by that was, and today we would just call this deficit spending, is all it is, right? But massive deficit spending. The government has enough credit to be able to borrow money, to spend that money to try to stimulate the economy, right? So we would today actually, right, a stimulus package is what we're talking about here. And the point of that was that, yes, it puts the government in massive debt. Absolutely it does, right? But the hope was, the belief was, that that money would be spent on job creation and putting people back to work, which they would then take their wages and buy stuff as consumers. That would help sort of stimulate the economy and get us out of this economic crisis. And then over time, as we have recovery through taxes and cutting of spending, you pay back that deficit, that debt that was created, right? So that's the general theory here, right? Deficit spending, you spend obviously more than you're bringing in to stimulate the economy. And Roosevelt absolutely hated this idea when he first came into office. He very much believed in a balanced budget, right? But he eventually, right, so here's going to be one of his first flip-flops here, is that he will be willing to experiment with this and to spend money to try to stimulate the economy, right? And this is one of the great criticisms of Roosevelt. Afterwards, historians and political pundits looking back saying, well, Franklin deficit Roosevelt, right? That he was spending us into, financial crises. His real problem was he didn't spend enough money. He didn't spend enough money, right? When he actually gets it in his head, this will be 1937, so into his second term, we were having some economic recovery, a little bit, and because of that, he cut the budget drastically. Like, all right, we're out of this Great Depression. When he cut that budget, we go right back to where we were almost in 1932, right? So that's where he really became committed to massive deficit spending to get us out of the Great Depression. Yeah?
He said he spent some, he thought we were out, and he cut it, and we went back in?
Exactly right. So as soon as he cut spending, it pushed us right back into almost where we were at the worst of the Depression in 1932. Now, this is that first 100 days we were talking about just a moment ago here, right? Action and action. Now, this is where he was exercising that power, that first 100 days, right? And I think in many ways this was a real testament to his political skill here, that the American people wanted somebody, to take some action, right? Try to do something to get us out of this. And that was his great sort of skill here, was understanding that action had to be taken. Okay, so the first 100 days. And as I said, after that, every president coming in kind of gets this grade. How is things going in the first 100 days, right? It's a rather arbitrary sort of number, but it shows just how desperate we were when he took office. But it was in that first 100 days that so much legislation was passed. Okay, now let's just consider some of his policies. All right, some of the programs here. When we talk about the New Deal and the policies that are going to be put in place, it breaks down into three categories, right? Relief, recovery, and reform. So we want to pass legislation or enact policies that will deal with the immediate suffering of millions of people, right? Relief. This is one of the things that Herbert Hoover refused to do, right? Or did very little, is to deal with actually helping people who were homeless, people who were out of work, people who couldn't feed themselves, right? The belief was, according to Hoover, is that, well, if you start giving out government assistance here, people are going to not have any incentive to work. They'll just stay on the dole, for the rest of their lives, right? So we can't help people, because if we do that, they'll never help themselves, right? Well, that's a 19th century mentality, right? As I said, there's a lot of times where people need a little help to get through, but most people, not everybody, certainly people will take advantage of it, but most people, they would much rather work than they would just to be given government assistance, right? So relief, right? We'll talk about that in just a moment. Recovery is going to be, very important, because it's like, how do we get out of the Great Depression, right? How do we get out of this problem that we're in? And then the most important, this is the legacy of the New Deal, is how do we reform the system, the capitalist system, to prevent this from happening in the future, right? So the long-term reform is going to be the great legacy of the New Deal, and much of this, not all of it, but much of it, is still very much with us today, all right? But we'll also see that particularly when the late 20th century, men like Ronald Reagan, men like George H.W. Bush, men like Bill Clinton, right? Again, I think in many ways we get too caught up in this Republican-Democrat thing. Those guys are all ultimately on the same side, and that is it's about money, right? Clinton, this great liberal Democrat, why did Clinton get elected? Because he out-Republicaned the Republicans, right? And I'll give you some examples of that here in just a moment. But it's about money, right? And in the late 20th century, there was a systematic effort to undo much of the reforms of the New Deal. And look what happens when we did it. Here we are right now in this crisis that we're in. All right? So let's consider a couple of things here. First, number one crisis we've got to deal with is the banks. This is the financial underpinning and infrastructure of the entire system, right? Thousands and thousands of banks had failed. Okay? So the first thing Roosevelt did, right? It was kind of interesting. If you just want a kind of sense of Roosevelt as a politician, right? On inaugural day in March of 1933, when he was inaugurated, it's very typical that you would have inaugural balls and galas and parties and celebrations, right? I think something like when Obama was inaugurated, there was like 18 or 20 of these different parties, and they're not all his parties. Everybody just wants to throw a party and that kind of stuff. When Roosevelt took office, he did not even go to the inaugural balls. He went right to work. Right? Now again, whether he wanted to go or not, just think of the message that sends, right? Action and action now. Okay? So the first thing he did in office was to declare a bank holiday. Every bank in the United States is closed for 4 days. Right? Every bank. Because this is what's happening. This is a picture of a run on a bank. Everybody's scrambling to the bank to get out their money before it's all gone. Well, how much cash do banks have on hand? Not much, right? Because the whole point is that they're using your money. That's investments, right? They take your money and they invest it in other things, like the stock market, by the way, right? So the point is, this is a panic, and if everybody starts pulling their money out, banks are done, right? So, and what that really speaks to is confidence. Do you have confidence in the bank or not? And that's the problem here, is that fundamentally we had no confidence in this whole system. So the banks were collapsing. So Roosevelt issued a bank holiday, right? March 5th, every bank in the United States would be closed for 4 days. And the point of that was to go in and try to enact some legislation and some reform to, again, first of all, just kind of stop the bleeding here, right, to keep some of these banks from failing, but to then start to analyze which banks were solvent, sound, and which ones maybe needed to go, right? Because remember, this was a sick economy back in the 1920s, and I mean unhealthy, right? And a lot of these banks simply were not, stable institutions. They needed to go away, right? So there was this kind of restructuring of 4 days here to look at all of these banks and see who can get some help, who can make it, which ones need to go, right? When this holiday was over, the Emergency Banking Act, which is a form of reform, right, went into effect March 9th. The Emergency Banking Act did a couple of things, right? One, it provided federal money, so this is that deficit spending stimulus package, Keynesian economics. The federal government provided monies to banks to help them recover, right? But it also created the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Again, this is still with us today. Every time you go through the bank, you'll see a little FDIC. And the point of this was that the federal government was going to guarantee a certain amount of your savings. If the bank should collapse, the investor would get some of that money back. At this point, it was about $2,000, I want to say, maybe $2,500, right? What is it today that the FDIC will guarantee? About 250? Is it 250? Yeah. And even that, just recently, over the last 15 years, I remember as a kid, it was about 100,000, right? But the point of it is that the federal government is now getting involved. And remember, that's the big thing that's changing with the Great Depression. The federal government is going to assume a tremendous amount of responsibility that it hadn't had before. This is one of those, right? So it's a way to guarantee some semblance that if you invest in the bank, you're not going to lose everything, right? What's it about? Restoring confidence in the bank. Now, in doing this, because they had enacted the FDIC, when we reopen the banks, more money becomes deposited than was being withdrawn, right? So it did work, right? We also officially and finally get off the gold standard, right? Got off the gold standard. By the way, what is the basis of when you pull out your dollar bill today, what gives that dollar bill any value? Where does the value come from?
Credit of the U.S.
What's that?
The credit of the U.S.
Okay, but even then, that comes to where does the credit going to come from, though? The backing of your dollar bill ultimately comes down to the faith in the American people that it's worth something, right? Because there is no actual, financial, resources that can actually cover all of that, right? It's about faith and confidence, right? As long as we all believe it's worth $1, then it's worth $1. But as soon as we all stop thinking that it's worth 10 cents, well, go get your money quick, because it ain't going to be around much longer, right? But here's a really important law that was passed, the Glass-Steagall Act. Right? Now, this is about reform. Because one of the big problems that had gotten us into this mess was commercial investment banks were taking, what this did was it created a wall between private banks, that is, the banks that most of us would put our deposit, our checking accounts and our savings account. They put a wall between that money and commercial investment banks that tended to, again, a little higher risk, play in the stock market, things like that, right? It created a wall between them so that you couldn't take people's life savings and gamble with it, or at least not, it restricted that, all right? So it was an attempt to try to, prevent what had happened back in the 20s, particularly with the stock market crash, of a lot of investment bankers and brokers and mortgage dealers gambling with people's savings and checking accounts and things like that, right? Because again, we're putting our money into the bank, not necessarily knowing exactly what or how they're going to invest it. I mean, we have much greater control over that now. But that was the point of the Glass-Steagall Act, is to kind of create a safety net here by separating sort of private banks that most average ordinary citizens would keep their checking and savings accounts in, and commercial investment banks. All right. Now, this is about reform, trying to prevent this crisis from happening again. That massive speculation that was going on in the 1920s. Well, Glass-Steagall Act was repealed in the 1990s. And you can thank Slick Willie for that, Bill Clinton. Okay? As well as Phil Gramm, this Republican senator from Texas, right? So again, it isn't a Republican-Democrat thing, it's a money thing, right? And once you got rid of that wall, commercial investment banks began playing with private investment bank money, and we see where it ended up with us today, right? So again, that systematic undoing of many programs coming out of the New Deal really put our financial system at risk, right? Relief. Let's consider some of the relief that was going on. This is what's going to make Roosevelt so popular, is simply caring enough to try to help people who can't even feed themselves or their children, right? Putting people back to work, even if it was minimal wages, or not minimum wage, but just low wages, right? And menial labor, right? So we have a couple of programs here. The Works Progress Administration. Sometimes, by the way, you'll see this is called the alphabet soup legislation. The WPA, the CCC, the NRA. Things like of this nature. So the WPA. Basically, this was a stimulus package to put Americans to work to rebuild roads and bridges and sewers and parks and all of the things that is basic infrastructure to urban life, right? Put people to work. That, that $2 million bulldozer with hydraulic power, let that sit over there for a moment, because I can put 50 guys to work with shovels over here, right? Putting people to work. Yeah.
Was this what the deficit spending was going towards?
Absolutely, absolutely, right? That is putting the money, taking the money, and trying to create jobs, even if they're minimalist jobs, to try to put people back to work, right? Now, the Works Progress Administration is a stimulus package, to use modern language, to put people to work, particularly in urban areas, in the cities, okay? The same principle was also enacted only out in the sort of the countryside and rural areas with the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps. So this is where the federal government took, put millions of young men, particularly, who had nothing to do in the cities, put them out into the wilderness, put them out into the national forest, put them out into, rural America, get them to, build roads, to, plant trees and reforest the wilderness, to run electricity, that basic infrastructure of electricity, connect all of these very rural, small farming communities, right? And if you've ever heard the phrase, another day, another dollar, this is where it came from, right here, because they were paid $1 a day, right? $1 a day. Now, not great wages, but certainly better than no wages at all, right? And the point is that Roosevelt is trying to put people to work, not simply give handouts out. Right? Recovery. How do we get out of this mess? Well, this is going to be the hardest of all three to do, right, is economic recovery, as we're experiencing right now, right, is how do we get this thing to grow, right, the economy to grow, right? Well, there are a number of agencies and organizations associated with recovery, but none more so than the National Recovery Administration, the NRA, right? Now, here's the problem with the NRA. And Roosevelt's going to take a hit on this one politically. This is going to be a failure, absolute failure. Right? But let's consider what happened and why it was a failure. All right? What Roosevelt did was mandate that all of the leading industry, well, just all industry together, right? So auto manufacturing, steel, electricity, garment manufacturing, everybody come to Washington and come up with, that is the leaders of your industry, come up with a code of, prices, wages, production, costs. That is, come up with a planning code that if we can do this, your industry will recover, right? So he's basically asking, but while requiring, that they figure out some kind of a plan that their industry, if we follow that plan, can recover from, okay? So Roosevelt is not writing this legislation. He is not the one coming up with the codes. He is telling those leaders in these industries, come up with a plan to get out of this problem, right? So these are the famous planning codes, okay? Well, here's the problem with them. When they are actually enacted, these planning codes, what it did was limit competition. It restricted competition here, right? Because remember, that was one of the problems back during the 1920s with this massive industrial sort of overhaul in electricity, is it led to overproduction, right? And overproduction is one of the big problems that caused the Great Depression, right? So most of these planning codes involved limiting or restricting competition in some form or fashion, all right? Now, Roosevelt deserves the responsibility because he signed on to this. He didn't write these codes, but he signed it into law, okay? And here's the problem, is that all of these codes are going to go before the Supreme Court and be declared unconstitutional because it limited or restricted competition. Now, this is going to be Roosevelt's big nemesis, is the Supreme Court. And here's an example of this. This is 1935. The Supreme Court struck down the planning codes, deemed them unconstitutional, and ultimately, as a result of that, the National Recovery Administration was a complete failure. No recovery whatsoever, but it also, of course, means that Roosevelt takes the political hit here, because that kind of, the phrase you hear a lot of times when new administrations come in, the honeymoon is over when they hit their first big snag. This was it, the Supreme Court. That is going to be Roosevelt's nemesis, right? Now, interestingly enough, Roosevelt's response to this was, these Supreme Court justices are kind of old. They need some help. Let's expand the number of justices we have. And these new justices, well, they'll be able to help these old guys. Well, what is he trying to do? He's trying to stack the court in favor of his policies. I'm going to appoint all these justices who won't rule my policies unconstitutional, right? And of course, this is his famous, what they call the court packing plan, court packing. Right? He called it court reform, but he's basically trying to stack the deck, as any politician would, right? And it is, of course, absolutely rejected, right? So again, that New Deal honeymoon, completely over in 1935. Now, he's still popular amongst the people, but this is where he starts to get that resistance from the other branches of government, which, by the way, is a healthy thing. You need that kind of checks and balances. Nobody should have that much power, right? Even if you love the guy, all right? Agricultural Adjustment Act, another aspect of reform. Recovery. And this one may be one of the most bizarre commentaries on capitalism itself, right? And you can understand why they're going to do it here, and I'll explain it in a minute. But man, this just seems bizarre, right? Here's the problem with like manufacturing is, well, what is the biggest problem? We're making too much of it. Overproduction. Well, that is exactly what's happening out on the farms, right? The Great Depression actually begins about 1927 or so out on the farms because agriculture was quite successful, quite efficient, overproductive, right? And the problem is that the more farm produce you produce, prices drop, which means farmers actually struggle, right? And this was the biggest problem, is that the more they produced, the less money they made, because it was flooding the market, supply is high, demand becomes very low, right? So, and now remember, just as an aside, that's That's what makes the Dust Bowl, right? Oklahoma, Kansas, northern Texas, this ecological disaster, as well as over plowing, right, and ripping up the soil there with this 10-year drought. The Dust Bowl is the exception to agricultural produce and sort of successful farming in the 1930s, right? In the Dust Bowl, it's a disaster, but the rest of the country is a boom time, right? And here's the problem, is that we're making too much food. So the Agricultural Adjustment Act started paying farmers to not grow food. Or how about this? Let's plow up fields of food now instead of harvesting them because it'll put more food on the market and drive prices down. So this is a policy here which is going to give subsidies, government subsidies to farmers to ultimately do what? Control the supply, limit the supply.
We get paid not to work.
Say it again?
Then we get paid not to work.
Well, it's not necessarily not to work. I mean, it's still a lot. Farm life is still very difficult. But ultimately, yeah, they're paid not. Let's leave those fields alone for a little while. Focus on some other stuff, right? But notice the irony of that. You got people starving in the streets, in the cities, and yet we're plowing up food in the fields out in the countryside, right? And why? Because the capitalist market says this is the way to increase prices, which raise revenue for farmers. And by the way, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, successful. It absolutely caused farm prices to rise, and farmers did better as a result of it. But think of the commentary that says about the society, that you're paying people to destroy food as people can't feed themselves in the city. Right? Something is out of whack with that.
Did parity prices for farmers come out of the Agricultural Adjustment Act?
Did what?
The parity price?
What do you mean by that?
Well, it was like the fairness prices for all farmers. Like the government set a cap on all the prices for the food that they're growing.
I don't know. I'm not sure of that,
That's fine.
that concept. I'll just admit ignorance on that one. But this worked. Prices went up, right? Because they ultimately cut production. Reform. Let's consider some policies of reform. Tennessee Valley Authority, the TVA. This was an attempt to bring, well, not an attempt, they did, a plan to bring electricity to rural farmers in the South. So this is about putting hydroelectric dams, building massive construction projects to dam up rivers like the Tennessee River in the Tennessee Valley and create power, electricity, from these hydroelectric dams, right? And the problem here, of course, is that private and commercial construction companies, utility companies, absolutely complained that this was government interference, and how can we compete with the government because they're doing all of this with tax money and borrowed money and driving the prices down, right? Because what they're actually doing was providing very cheap electricity to millions of people in the South, right? Now, this also put people to work in constructing all of this, right? The CCC guys out there running, electricity and stuff like that, but the actual construction of these dams put a lot of people to work. But what this ultimately did was it put so many poor people out on the farms onto the grid. That is connecting them to the American society economically by bringing electricity there. And they did it efficiently, and they did it cheaply, and they didn't do it for profit, and as a result, people benefited from that, except for corporations that would have made money off of that, right? So this creates a kind of an idea here that the government should maybe be involved in providing some of the basic utilities like electricity, like sewers, like roads and things of that nature, right? The things that we all need every day. The government's going to provide those things, again, through taxes and stuff like that, but it's because it benefits everybody, right? But notice when this stuff starts to be challenged, right? Again, late 20th century, you can go back to Reagan with this, you can go to Clinton with this, right? Go to Enron with this. You can go to all the problems in California, deregulation, right? And when you start to make this stuff more about profit, we're going to see a lot of economic problems as a result of that. Okay? The Securities and Exchange Commission. This was a government regulatory agency to provide oversight of the stock market. Right? This is an attempt to prevent the stock market crash and all of that massive speculative boom that we had in the 1920s. So, for example, this is going to make insider trading illegal. Right? Insider trading. So that means that if I'm a stockbroker or if I work in a corporation, I know that something bad is about to happen. I can't go tell people to sell all your stock because you're about to lose money because I have inside information. That's the kind of stuff that creates panics and creates fraud to some extent, right? Is the fear and the rumors that can come from that kind of stuff. So insider trading becomes illegal, and this is again a government agency designed to provide oversight of the stock market to prevent what happened with the 1929 crash. Interestingly enough, you may have heard this just recently on the news, politicians are not bound by the same rules as stockbrokers are in terms of insider trading, right? If they hear that there's a big project going on that's going to involve stock, that affect stock prices, they are not bound by the SEC to not suddenly go sell all their stock or to go buy a bunch of stock, right? As well as all their staffers and stuff like that. So, and this happens all the time, right? So again, when politicians are, when it's for profit, you can see how it's going to affect many of the decisions they're going to make, right? The National Labor Relations Act. This is the most important piece of legislation to affect American labor in the entire history of American labor, right? It is sometimes referred to as the Wagner Act, because Senator Robert Wagner sponsored this bill, right? So National Labor Relations Act or the Wagner Act, it's the same thing, and this is what it did, right? Remember the lectures that we've seen so far in terms of organized labor and the AFL or down the previously the Knights of Labor, this unions is what we're talking about here. They had no legal protection, none whatsoever, right? And if the government ever decided to crack down on them or issue court injunctions or prevent or ban strikes, then they were done. They couldn't fight it, right? Well, this gives unions for the first time legal protection. The first time they have the right to strike, right? And they have the right to make sure, on the other side of that unions do not practice coercive behavior to make sure that all of these workers do what the union says as well, right? So this is the problem, is that unions themselves, which are, again, they're not out to overthrow capitalism. It's really concessions that corporations give to workers to get them to go along with the system here, is that unions themselves can become corrupt. They become fabulously corrupt, right? Because they become powerful, they become rich, and they can become very coercive of workers themselves. So on the one hand, the National Labor Relations Act gave unions the right to exist and the right to engage in strikes. By the way, it gave them the right to engage in collective bargaining, right? Which means that we get to determine or negotiate contracts, wages, collectively for everybody, not one-on-one. Because if you're negotiating one-on-one, you're going to lose that one every time. But if we negotiate together, right, then you're going to stand a better chance of getting a better or fairer deal, right? So it gave them the right to strike. It gave them the right to engage in collective bargaining. But it also tried to make sure that there wasn't corruption or fraud within the unions by forcing people to be part of unions if they didn't want to be, right? But it's at this point that the unions are going to become more successful because now they have the ability to engage in strikes and collective bargaining. Right? Social Security Act of 1935. Now, this is the one that, oh boy, is there a lot of opinions about this today, right? About Social Security. Is it going to be there when I retire? And everybody says no. Well, it would be there if the government stopped taking from it, right? That's the first thing we might say about what this was, right? So the problem here is that Roosevelt, how do I say this? This is more than just economics. We kind of consider what this does, okay? Workers pay taxes, part of their wages or salaries, to the government, and the government takes that money and hangs on to it, invests it, savings, so that when you get older in life, right, you'll get a little bit of a pension to help you when you're no longer employable. Okay? That's the basic concept of this. Okay? Now, it does more than just that. Okay? It is also this idea that, people who are in between jobs, who are unemployed, they're still employable, but they're unemployed. Here's some money to help you get through these hard times until you can find another job, right? And then finally, it also provided some government assistance for people who are unemployable, people with disabilities, mental or physical, right? Or how about single mothers with dependent children, right? That is, in many ways, what this was really trying to do is, on the one hand, provide some kind of a safety net for people who were in financial crises of some sort. But notice, on the other hand, I think in many ways this is more than just about economics, because what this basically says is, how you determine the moral character of a society is how you treat, as the phrase is, the least among us, right? There is a certain kind of compassion or empathy for people who are struggling, people who need help, right? And in a very blatant capitalistic dog-eat-dog world, right? Too bad if you can't make it, right? That's that social Darwinism of the late 19th century, right? I think in many ways this is that, Roosevelt at his best here, suggesting that maybe as a society we ought to help the less fortunate, right? That is, what does it say about us as a people if we disregard those of our own people who are in desperate situations, right? Now, yeah, there are some financial problems with this, right? And yes, is there a chance that this money may not be there? Well, I paid money into this my whole life, but when I retire, it's not going to be there. It won't be enough to survive, right? Well, it's not meant to be, everything you'll need to survive. It's really meant to be, some assistance, right? But this is one of the big problems here. You remember back in the election of 2000, Al Gore, Democratic candidate, Mr. Environmentalism, right? He used the phrase lockbox, right? And of course, he was soundly criticized for that. And it does sound kind of corny, the lockbox, right? The Democrats have never been really good at kind of, marketing their ideas and stuff like that compared to the Republicans. But he was soundly criticized for that. But what was the concept of that? Is let's put this money in a lockbox where the government would not keep taking from it. And this is one of our big problems here, is that we kind of look at the Social Security Fund as a slush fund for whatever the government wants to do. Again, Republicans and Democrats do this kind of stuff. So if this money was not messed with, it would be there. And even as the way we're spending it now, at most, it would be a 20% reduction from expectations into the future, right? But notice what Bush wanted to do with Social Security a couple years ago. Let's privatize it all. Let's make it so that everybody gets to manage their own money, and guess what? We'll put it in the stock market. Well, what would have happened if we'd have done that a couple years ago? We'd have been toast. We'd have been toast, right? So I think in many ways this was a sense of trying to provide for assistance for people who need it in desperate times of their lives. Right? All right, wrapping up what Roosevelt was able to accomplish. He alleviated the suffering of millions of people. Government assistance, providing food, putting people to work even if they were minimal jobs. Right? That immediate crisis was averted. Right? I think that in the long run, he did restore the hope and the faith that we could get through this and preserve, even if we have to reform it, capitalism and democracy, basic American values, right? In many ways, Roosevelt saved capitalism from itself, right? Because capitalism without reform, without regulation, without oversight will ultimately destroy itself, right? And he was able to restore the hope and faith of millions that we could get through this. Long-term reform, right? He did put in place programs that would prevent another Great Depression for almost 60 to 70 years. And it's not until we began to systematically undo many of these reform programs that we start to have some of these crises again. Notice, as we said at the beginning of the Great Depression, that the descriptions of the crisis we're in now or the crisis we might have been in a couple of years ago without some of this, government bailouts and stimulus and things like that. And, again, despite whatever your opinion is about that, it did help, right? Even if it didn't help enough. But the point is that all of these sort of problems were compared to, we're on the edge of another Great Depression, or the idea that we averted a disaster that was almost as bad as the Great Depression, right? Well, that's because we had policies in place until the last couple of decades that undermined some of this reform, right? And perhaps to a certain extent, this last one is going to be very important because, when we talk about, the Democratic Party rising to power, one of the, the phrase of the Democrats is the party of the people. Well, up until this time, the Democratic Party was also the party of the white South, white supremacy. But, today, overwhelmingly, minorities and particularly African Americans, they vote Democratic more than they do Republican. Why? Because of Franklin Roosevelt. This is going to change the political alignments in the United States so that groups that had never voted Democrat before will begin to vote Democrat and do so to this very day because he rebranded the Democratic Party. It's really under Roosevelt that the modern definitions of what a liberal is, because it was the liberal wing of the Democratic Party that Roosevelt was part of, began to emerge, right? So shaping attitudes and stances of political parties, particularly the Democratic Party, is what Roosevelt is also quite responsible for as well. In many ways, creating much of what we understand political parties to be today happened as a result of the Great Depression. Now, as everybody's all packing up, careful, I got a couple minutes here. Let's answer this question, or let's conclude with this question here. Was the New Deal successful? Did it get us out of the Great Depression?
Yes and no.
No, it did not. But the yes part of it is important to consider, right? The policies of the Great Depression, of the New Deal during the 1930s before World War II, we did not get out of the Great Depression, right? We had recovery. We had growth. We were sort of climbing out of the Great Depression, but we never got out of it. Unemployment, I think that the best unemployment ever got during the 1930s was about 16 or 17%, which is still outrageously high, right? Now, it was 25% in 1932, right? So we never got out of the Great Depression because of the New Deal. But then we need to expand that just a moment. What did get us out of the Great Depression? Everybody wants to say, well, it was World War II that got us out of the Great Depression, but not the New Deal. But what is World War II? How does World War II get us out of the Great Depression? Because the federal government borrowed all kinds of money and put people to work building a war machine. That is, it is the biggest stimulus package this country has ever seen, right? And nobody criticizes putting people to work for the war effort. But they're quite happy to put people to, criticize the government for putting people to work planting trees out in the Yellowstone or something like that, right? But the point is, the economic principle is exactly the same. The government spent money, and this time we justify it because it's a war, right? But at the same time, it's government funding to put people to work, which ultimately got us out of the Great Depression. It is exactly the same thing. Deficit spending, stimulated the economy, military success. All right. That's all we have for this. Next time is the exam, and then we'll move on to World War II after this.